Okay, so basically Tim opened his talk by, noticing, and something I have to notice because I'm part of the Centre of History of Emotions, is that history of emotions seems to have come to dominate recent debate and recent areas of excitement, and Laura's conference and all of you being here today is a testament to that. I'm also struck that within that emotional turn, there's been a couple of really dominant recent turns, and one of them has been towards material history, to an emphasis on material culture, and another one, which Laura in her own work exemplifies, is this turn to exploring the relationship between emotions and magic. And in a programmatic piece written just a couple of years ago, Laura called for people to interrogate this kind of vexed relationship between emotion and material culture. And so I'll read it out because she says it rather beautifully, and rather more beautifully than I could do. She calls for historians to basically undertake with a deeper engagement with the physical and spatial context in which emotions are performed, the kind of thing that Lyndall was talking about this morning, alongside the body in doing the emotions. And she also says that this ties in with a so-called material turn in history. If historians have now understood the way that people emotionally relate to things as a history, we need to have a clearer sense of the material conditions in which emotions are performed. So what I want to do today is try and think about that kind of much claimed and much discussed and much trumpeted relationship between emotions and material culture. Now, in one sense, of course, this turn to material culture is hardly surprising. One only needs to switch on Netflix or pick up The Observer to realise that we've recently become obsessed with seeing our emotional lives in terms of stuff. So, there's no pride. Does anybody recognise who this lady is? Yeah, so it's Marie Kondo. And one of the striking things at Marie Kondo, if you watch the programmes, if you follow the debates on Twitter or wherever, one of the claims that is being made is that we somehow get a grip on our living rooms, if we somehow get a grip on our desks, then somehow we'll have happier and more productive and more sexually athletic lives. But this kind of sudden change in the way we see ourselves is really striking, because only 10 years ago, if you went into a self-help section of a bookshop, the books were all about dealing with our past. Nowadays, they're all about dealing with our stuff. And I'm interested in a way that we feel that we can somehow engage with ourselves. We can somehow get a grip on subjectivity just by buying a set of desk tidies or caddies and somehow pushing stuff around and rearranging our rooms. So there's something that seems to be going on in wider everyday culture that historians are picking up on. Now, at one level, I think an argument could be made that this relationship has always been hiding in clear sight. Certainly, if one goes back to the kind of classic texts of the 1970s, kind of classic texts that Tim was wistfully talking about, something like Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, one can argue that that is actually a book about the history of emotions. It's a book about anxiety and people's everyday worries, and the way they're worked through by turning to a new reliance on magic, by turning to reliance on spells and witches, in order to give us a sense of security in our lives. And what Thomas offers there, you could argue against this, but I would claim that what Thomas offers there is a suggestion that magic disappears as new material sources become available. As we develop material technologies such as a leather hose pipe for putting out fires, for dealing with our anxiety, we no longer need to use incantations, we no longer need to use wise women to kind of get a grip on our inner lives, to get a grip on those feelings. So this is something we've been working at for a long time. But I would argue that it's also something we've been working at in a slightly puzzling and inadequate way. Because even though there's now this really rich literature out there on emotions and material culture, you kind of read it and you kind of think like, because it's problematic. And I think it's problematic because of the words that we use, because of the way that we try to imagine this relationship between things and interior. I can't do THs, I'm no old, but you know what I'm saying. Things, stuff, and our interiority. Basically, we use all these words like objects evoke feelings, objects sustain feelings, kind of like objects, we treat objects like text, that we somehow are inscribed with feelings and inscribe feelings back into us. All of these are kind of slightly magical metaphors, which I would argue obscure but real work that's going on between affect and material substance. We still don't have a really good way of trying historically to get a grip on that relationship. Now, I would argue, I'm going to argue in fact, that there's one historian out there who can help us do, he's a dead historian, but one person who really helps us do that is the philosopher Rg Collinwood. Now, Rg Collinwood, I guess, is really kind of unfashionable these days. He used to be he was basically a standard work when I was at university, because he's probably the only British historiographer and the only British historian to really think carefully about the philosophy of history in the interwar years. And he still used to be on reading lists in my time, but I guess he's now just about falling out of fashion. Where he is written about, and where he does tend to come up, is in discussions of empathy. So a lot of historians, particularly psychoanalytically minded colleagues like Michael Roper and Barbara Taylor, look to Collingwood. Do you all know Collingwood's notion of reenactment? So Collingwood said that basically, if you want to be a true historian, if you want to really engage in history, then you have to relive the thoughts of a dead actor, you have to relive the thoughts of your subject in your own mind. He sees true historical understanding, historical knowledge, as a peculiar kind of psychological operation, a peculiar kind of mental practice in which we manage to actually somehow resurrect the thoughts of the dead and replay their chain of logic in our own mind. And you can see why that understanding of history is deeply attractive to psychoanalytically minded historians, because it seems to offer an anticipation of this idea that we must develop an empathic relationship with our subjects. So we must somehow put ourselves into their shoes and develop this kind of like affective connection. That view, and even though I really like people like Barbara Taylor, that view is fundamentally mistaken. And it mistakes what Collingwood is trying to do in his writings. Because Collingwood does not really believe that you can do a history of emotions. He thinks that he comes out of a tradition of British idealist philosophy, and he thinks there's an absolute distinction between the world of the intellect and the world of feeling and the world of emotion. And to illustrate why the reenactment model that he kind of like suggests is not equivalent to empathy, he gives a model of, basically it's a kind of fairly sexist model, but he gives the example of a scientist dealing with the sympathy of his wife. And so like a scientist might have a terrible day at the lab, he comes home, his wife will sympathise with his feelings, but she won't have any intellectual grasp on the problems that he was dealing with. So she's not reenacting what she's going through, she's just feeling a kind of bodily connection. So this isn't, reenactment is not empathy, there's two separate processes there. Okay, just gonna have a glass of water and I'll go on to the next stage of my argument. So, one of the things that has come up today, it's come up in Tim's talk and it's come up in Lyndall's talk, is the difficulty of ascribing emotions to other people. And one of the things that comes out in Collingwood's own writings, in his autobiography and his musings on art, is that difficulty that we have in ascribing emotions to others is also a difficulty we have in ascribing emotions to ourselves. When we all talk about how difficult it is, and Thomas was saying this rather beautifully and succinctly, we all talk about how difficult it is to put emotion terms onto different actions, onto different experiences that people might have had. That difficulty is not simply for historians. That's a difficulty that we all face in our everyday lives, in trying to get a grip on our rather messy and inchoate experiences and put them into a language which we can share and understand. And indeed, what Collingwood offers in his book he wrote just before he died, The New Leviathan, it's kind of a rather political tract against the rise of Nazism, but he sees that rise of Nazism in terms of a problem that people have in imagining and engaging with their own emotions. And he comes out with a model that seems a tiny bit like an anticipation of William Reddy's own model of emotives. So he says, so do you want to read this out for me, Eva? Do it in a kind of like voice of an interwar English gentleman, and you can do it.
I'm objective.
Okay.
name the feeling awakens his consciousness of the feeling. There is a tendency to put the cart before the horse and fancy that consciousness of the feeling comes first and finding a name for it afterwards, but that is a mistake due to false analogy with cases that are essentially different. For example, when an explorer sees an unrecorded mountain and then finds a name for it, or when you or I, out for a walk, see a little pink flower and wonder what its name is.
Okay, and then he goes on to say, thank you very much, that was brilliant. And he goes on to say, rid yourself of these misleading analogies and fix your mind at the point at issue. And you'll see that the practical act of naming a feeling is what actually makes you conscious of it. Now, the important thing in Collingwood is actually his fascination with that practical act. He says the naming of a feeling isn't just like picking a word out of the air and somehow getting a set of inchoate processes to coalesce. He actually sees it as a piece of labour. It involves comparison, it involves work, it involves like taking what he calls the sensor of everyday life. I'll go on to this slide. The sense of everyday life. So that's basically when an infant experiences the world, like you see the colour red, it's also associated with anger. There's lots of water coming to me in an odd... I don't know what kind of desperation's written across my face. But basically, let me just go back to a baby's desperation. So like when a baby according to Collingwood, when a baby encounters the colour red, it will also experience it as angry. And detaching that anger from the redness is an intellectual task. It's a task of cognitive labour. We're separating out the kind of feeling from the sensor. So there's all this work going on before we even manage to find something to put a name to it. And Collingwood's interested in that moment. And he describes it very well in his own autobiography. He's a deeply precocious child. His father is Ruskin's secretary. He's brought up in the Lake Districts. His kind of babysitter is Arthur Ransom. He spends his time canoeing and engaged in archaeological digs, reading Kant. And a lot of his time kind of like thinking about the problems of consciousness as an 8-year-old. And when he's thinking about the problems of consciousness, he finds that he can't, I also find I can't quite put it into words when I try to think about problems of consciousness, but he can't quite put it into words. And so what he does is he goes off and makes a kind of little chain of paper soldiers. And then that kind of irritation that he feels is somehow better and the things are clearer in his mind. So it's that process of clarification. And that kind of feeling, that apprehension of the difficulty of making sense of the messiness of our inner lives stays with him until his early death at the age of 50. So in a series of lectures on enchantment that he gives at the Folklore Society in 1937, he described how close his own work as an academic was to the kind of shamanic work that a shaman in a hunting tribe might undertake amongst the lapse. He says, so a hunter, when he's trying to make sense of his feelings, when he's trying to make sense of his relationship to the animals, doesn't address his problems in philosophical prose, but in a ritual, which he devises and performs about as blindly and about as intelligently as I write these sentences. I write these sentences not knowing why I write them or whether anyone will read them, not even sure I'm making my thought clear to myself or anyone else, but knowing that there's something in me which craves expression, and knowing if I can express it at all, I must express it through a pen-driving ritual that is the custom of my tribe. Now, what's interesting about Collingwood is that he sees this actual practice of writing, this kind of actual practice of we all do of tapping on a laptop, as something shamanic. It's a kind of semi-magical act for somehow making our emotions clear. So it's a bodily practice as well as a cognitive process that are integrated in this moment. And indeed, in his own work on the philosophy of art, he emphasises this connection between magic and emotion. He says a large part of art can be seen as a magical act. He says that art exists for a large part, not completely, there's different kinds of art, but a large part of art exists as a way of marshalling and organising our emotions, of creating kinds of feeling in people, in order to get them to undertake certain kinds of tasks, in order to get them to undertake like political and cultural affiliations. He sees art as deeply productive, and he sees it being productive on an effective level. And this is a theme he returns to again and again. So I want to think about how did this Oxford... How am I doing for time? Oh, sorry. I'm fine, okay. So I want to think about how does an Oxford philosopher get interested in this process of expression and get interested in these kind of magical practices. And partly he does it because a little known part of Collingwood's career is that from the early 1930s, he starts spending 1 day a week working in a therapy centre for nervous and difficult children in Ladbroke Grove. The therapy centre had been set up by an old friend of his, an ex-girlfriend, Margaret Lowenfelt, as a clinic for nervous and difficult children, for working children who had just come into the attention of all those charitable and child guidance authorities that you see emerging in the interwar period. Oh, right, okay. And basically, what Lowenfelt does in her clinics is develop a technique which has now become quite famous, called the world technique. She encourages children to start building tiny model worlds, to start taking plastic cows, to start taking things like toy soldiers, and building scenarios. And through making those worlds, she argues they make sense of their own emotions, and they articulate a new kind of subjective life. And this idea that in making sense of ourselves, we also build a world, is something that's fundamental to Collingwood's own philosophy. In one of his early works, Speculum Mentis, he says the mind can never know itself. It can only know itself through making, through describing a world about us and then using materials of that world to rebuild an inner life. Now, is that for me, that 5-minute sign? Is it so? Okay, I'll stop quite soon then.
It's not that time, but...
Is it that time? 5 minutes? Okay, so I can talk about this in more detail in the question. I've got 5 minutes left to see. Okay, so I can talk about this in more details in the questions. But basically, the way that he imagines this inner process, I think, draws from early 20th century theories of aesthetics, in particular Vernon Lee's model of empathy, and I'll talk about that later, and I'll say why that version of empathy, which is circulating in the 1910s and the 1920s in Britain, is very different to a model of empathy which historians use today. And it's different because it comes out of art appreciation, and it emphasises that in finding our way around a picture, in appreciating a picture, we involve ourselves in it bodily. So Collingwood uses this in his Philosophy of Art book to describe his engagement with Cézanne painting. He doesn't just look at the painting, he feels his body in there, he sees his mind moving around amongst the objects in it, he actually finds himself transported, and through that act of transport starts to separate out his feelings and create a new kind of interior life. Okay, to cut to the quick. What's interesting, I think, for historians is that the materials that people are using for world making are, of course, historically specific. For Lowenfelt herself, she believed that the new way she was finding for children to articulate their psychological problems was partly made possible by the rise of mass manufacture, and in particular, the rise of mass-manufactured toys. She drew upon the work of people like Edith Nesbit and H.G. Wells, who both advocated a new form of pleasure called floor games, about using old cardboard boxes, Britain's toy soldiers, to create small imaginary worlds, and argued that this could be used for children to make sense of their interior lives. So what you're seeing here is how children are drawing on a very historically specific set of material conditions in order to build a historically specific kind of subjectivity. And so let me just end on morph for a second. So basically, I think one of the interesting questions that Collingwood's work raises is the actual relationship between material culture, between the things that we have available to us and the things we use to actually carve up our subjectivity, to actually take the sense of experience and to turn it into categories. And that's done by triangulating ourselves with historical conditions we live in. Okay, so I'll stop. Is that me at 20 minutes? I'll stop there. I could go on to Raymond Williams or Sartre, but I'll stop. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.